Well, we have now arrived at John chapter 3, which is a pretty well-known chapter in the Bible, especially because of two verses in particular, John 3:3 and John 3:16. You might have even seen, like on TV at a football game, someone holding up a sign that says John 3:3 or John 3:16. There's a whole lot in this chapter. We're going to have to split it up, so we'll look at verse 3 in this video and verse 16 in the next one. These statements of Jesus that are so well known, they come in a conversation with a man named Nicodemus. Nicodemus is, it says, a member of the Jewish ruling council. So he's a religious leader. He's a part of that group that was taking offense at Jesus at the end of the last chapter. And later on in the book, they'll become full-blown enemies of Jesus. But Nicodemus is different from all of his friends. He recognizes something special in Jesus that he can't ignore. So he comes to Jesus at night, because he doesn't want his peers to know about it. And he says to him, Rabbi, he calls him a rabbi, acknowledges him as a religious teacher. He says, we know you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you were doing if God were not with him. So he can't avoid the fact that Jesus is doing miracles. He knows that Jesus is from God. Maybe you remember at the end of the last chapter, it said that Jesus was doing a lot of signs while he was there in Jerusalem at the Passover feast. John just doesn't give us details of what those were, but they were enough to convince Nicodemus. What's interesting is that Jesus then answers a question that Nicodemus didn't ask. All Nicodemus says is, Jesus, you must be from God. And Jesus answers by saying, very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. Several things to notice there. First, Jesus doesn't say no one can get into heaven, which is what we sort of tend to insert in there mentally. He says no one can see the kingdom of God. And that's a huge topic that we will take on in another video. When we get toward the end of chapter 4, I'll spend some time talking about what the kingdom of God is. But then next, notice that Nicodemus doesn't ask about getting into the kingdom of God, but Jesus seems to think that's the question he should be asking. That's what you should want to know from me. And I think that's like us a lot of times. We come to Jesus with our questions, with our agenda. Jesus does care about those things, but what he cares about most is that we become citizens of his kingdom. But then the third thing, and the main thing to notice here, is how Jesus says people can see the kingdom of God. He says you must be born again. And that is, again, one of those really well-known phrases from the Bible. You've probably heard it. Christians use it a lot. Christians misuse it sometimes. Christians use it a lot without explaining it. So let's keep reading and see what Jesus actually means by that statement. In verse 4, Nicodemus doesn't get it. All he can picture is another physical birth, and he wants to know how a grown man can get back into his mother's womb to go through the birth process again. But Jesus explains in verse 5 that there are two types of birth. And he says you must be born of water and the Spirit. Now, some people have really confused this whole issue by saying that maybe being born of water has something to do with baptism. But it's actually simpler than that, and Jesus explains it in the very next verse. In verse 6, he says, flesh gives birth to flesh, and the Spirit gives birth to spirit. So we're talking about two types of birth, the birth of the flesh, where there is water involved. We are born of water when our mother's water breaks during the birth process. But then he says you must be born of the Spirit. Spirit gives birth to spirit. So a physical birth and then some kind of spiritual birth. And Jesus says you shouldn't be surprised by this. And then in verse 8, he makes a comparison to wind, which is invisible. We hear wind, we see the effects of wind, but we don't see wind. Not everything real is physical. There are invisible, or is visible, There are invisible things that greatly affect our lives. And Jesus says at the end of verse 8, so it is with everyone born of the Spirit. So people who've experienced spiritual birth have an invisible aspect of their lives that is changing them and moving in them in ways that nobody else can see. And what you see in the following verses, we won't read them all, is that Nicodemus still doesn't get it. Jesus criticizes him for being a religious leader who is somehow ignorant of spiritual things, about spiritual life. But here's the point, because I will put it as plainly as I can. Just because you are physically alive, and we all are, it doesn't mean that you are spiritually alive. You can walk and talk and eat and have a job and get married and have children and care deeply about those people. You can go to church and read the Bible and have opinions about religious things, and none of that means that you are alive in the sense that Jesus is talking about life here. You must be born again. You must have an experience of spiritual birth that is just as much a new beginning as your physical birth was. And then you can live a spiritual life that is just as real as the physical life you now live. And in the next video, we'll let Jesus explain how we can experience that new birth.